For decades, they kept quiet. Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall were the heart of one of television's greatest comedies. But behind the scenes, something was deeply wrong. The men who played Lenny and Squiggy weren't just scene-stealing characters. They were a problem nobody wanted to talk about. Until now. In a rare joint interview, both women finally reveal what really happened on the set of Laverne and Shirley, and why they stayed silent for so long. In 1976, ABC launched a show that would become a cultural phenomenon. Laverne and Shirley wasn't just a sitcom. It was the thing families gathered around. It was what kids quoted at school. It was what defined an entire era of television. The show ran for 8 seasons. It spawned a spin-off, created merchandise, lunchboxes, Halloween costumes. For millions of people, Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall were the 1970s and 80s. They were funny, fearless, and unstoppable, and everyone loved them. But here's what most people don't know. While America was laughing, something was happening behind those studio walls that neither woman has fully discussed until now. Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams had chemistry that couldn't be faked. They moved together like dancers. They timed their jokes like musicians. Their comedic instincts were so perfectly matched that people wondered if they were actually friends in real life. They weren't. But that didn't matter to audiences. What mattered was that magic on screen. And the magic was real. The show became so successful that it created a problem nobody anticipated. Success meant more episodes. More episodes meant longer days on set. Longer days meant more time around the same people. And one of those people, or rather, 2 of those people, became increasingly difficult to work with. Lenny and Squiggy, played by Michael McKean and David L. Lander, were comic relief characters. They lived downstairs. They burst through the door at random moments with absurd schemes and ridiculous voices. The audience loved them. The studio audience roared every single time they appeared. Their comedic timing was sharp. Their delivery was perfect. And their success on the show made them untouchable. That's where the problem began. For years, Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall did their jobs. They showed up. They hit their marks. They delivered their lines. They laughed at the right moments even when nothing felt funny anymore. But the weight of what was happening, what they were enduring, became heavier with every season. And neither woman knew the other was struggling in silence. It wasn't until much later that they would learn they'd been carrying the same burden all along. To understand what happened, you have to understand why Lenny and Squiggy mattered so much in the first place. Michael McKean and David L. Lander weren't just supporting cast members. They were the spark plugs of the entire show. When they weren't on screen, the energy shifted. When they appeared, the studio audience would erupt before they even said a word. That kind of power is rare in television. Michael McKean came from a musical background. He was classically trained, intelligent, and creative. David L. Lander was equally talented. A musician, a comedian, a performer who brought a physical comedy style that was impossible to ignore. Together, they created characters so memorable that people still quote Lenny and Squiggy jokes 50 years later. "Hey, hey, hey, what's going on?" became a catchphrase that defined a generation. The show's creators knew what they had. Lenny and Squiggy got some of the biggest laughs. They got airtime. They got love from the audience. And as their popularity grew, so did their sense of importance on set. This is where the dynamic started to shift. Cindy Williams was the professional. She trained as an actress. She approached her work with discipline and focus. She knew her lines. She knew her blocking. She was there to do a job and do it well. Penny Marshall came from a different world. She was a dancer, a choreographer, and she brought a looser, more physical energy to her comedy. But both women were consummate professionals. They were the leads. They carried the show on their shoulders every single episode. But here's what nobody talks about. The leads don't always have the power on set. Not when the supporting characters are getting the biggest laughs. As the show went on, McKean and Lander began to act like they owned the place. They would improvise lines that weren't in the script. They would add business, physical comedy, and bits that pushed the boundaries of what was written. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But more importantly, They started to behave in ways that made the set feel unsafe for everyone around them. Cindy and Penny noticed, but they didn't talk about it. Not to each other. Not to the producers. Not to anyone. They just endured. What neither woman realized was that the other was enduring it too. They were both carrying this alone, thinking they were the only ones who felt uncomfortable, the only ones who noticed, the only ones affected. Started small. Too small to complain about. Too small to make a big deal out of. But small things, when they happen every day, become big things. Michael McKean and David L. Lander began to treat the set like it was their kingdom. They'd show up late. They'd keep everyone waiting. Crew members would stand around. Other actors would run their lines. Producers would check their watches. And McKean and Lander would arrive whenever they felt like it, with no apology, no explanation. It was a power move. And it worked. Because nobody wanted to confront them. They were too valuable. Too popular. Too important to the show's success. But lateness was just the beginning. The real issue was how they treated the women around them. Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall started noticing a pattern. McKean and Lander would make comments. Not jokes. Comments. The kind of remarks that made you feel small. The kind of things that made you question whether you were being too sensitive or if something was genuinely wrong. They would dismiss ideas that Cindy and Penny suggested. They would interrupt during scenes. They would ad-lib in ways that stepped on other actors' lines, stealing moments that belonged to someone else. It was death by 1,000 cuts. No single incident was catastrophic enough to blow up over. But the accumulation of incidents created an atmosphere of tension and disrespect. Penny Marshall was the first to really feel it deeply. She was naturally funny, naturally confident, and she didn't take things lying down. But even she found herself second-guessing her own reactions. Was she being unreasonable? Was she being too sensitive? Was she reading too much into things? These are the questions that keep people silent. These are the lies we tell ourselves to avoid conflict. Cindy Williams, meanwhile, was more reserved by nature. She was quieter. She internalized things. She watched and observed and took mental notes. But she never said anything. She just got through each day. What's crucial to understand is that this wasn't happening in a vacuum. This was the 1970s and 80s. The power dynamics between men and women in Hollywood were completely different than they are today. Women were expected to be grateful for their roles. They were expected to get along. They were expected to laugh off inappropriate behavior and move on. Complaining meant risking your career. Speaking up meant being labeled a troublemaker. So Cindy and Penny stayed quiet. They showed up. They did their jobs. They smiled for the cameras. And they suffered in silence. But silence has a cost. And that cost was about to become impossible to ignore. As seasons passed, the behavior escalated. McKean and Lander weren't just being disruptive anymore. They were being deliberately hostile. And they were doing it in ways that were designed to humiliate. During one particular incident that Penny Marshall would later describe, Lander made a comment on set that crossed a line nobody should cross. It wasn't a joke. It was an attack. It was personal. And it was done in front of the entire crew. Penny felt her face go hot. She felt her hands shake. She wanted to say something. She wanted to fight back. But she didn't. She swallowed it down and kept working. Cindy had similar experiences. There were moments when she was trying to perform a scene, trying to be present and authentic, and McKean or Lander would do something designed to throw her off. Sometimes it was a crude remark. Sometimes it was physical. Standing too close, invading her space, making her uncomfortable. The goal seemed to be clear, to make her feel small. To remind her that she was, in their eyes, secondary to them. What made this particularly painful was the contrast. When the cameras were rolling, these men were charming. They were funny. They were beloved. The audience adored them. But the moment the director called cut, something switched. The charm evaporated. What remained was something much darker. The crew saw it. The producers saw it. Everyone on set knew what was happening. But nobody did anything about it. Why? Because Lenny and Squiggy were too important. They were too profitable. They were the engine that drove ratings. And in television, Ratings mean everything. There's a specific moment that Cindy Williams has described in recent interviews, a moment that she says made her realize this wasn't going to change. It was during a table read for an upcoming episode. Everyone was sitting around, scripts in hand, going through the lines. Lander made a comment that was designed to embarrass her in front of everyone. It was calculated. It was cruel. And when she didn't react the way he wanted, he doubled down. That's when Cindy understood something fundamental. These men didn't see her as an equal. They didn't see her as a fellow performer deserving of respect. They saw her as someone they could push around, someone they could dominate, someone whose discomfort was entertainment to them. Penny had reached the same conclusion months earlier, but she'd never told Cindy, and Cindy had never told Penny. They were both isolated in their suffering, both believing they were alone. The toxicity was poisoning the set. It was affecting the quality of their performances. It was affecting their mental health. It was affecting everyone around them. But the show went on, because the show always goes on. And behind the laughter, two women were learning to survive in an environment that had become hostile. Neither of them knew that their breaking point was coming. Survival in a hostile environment requires strategy. Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall developed their own coping mechanisms, though they didn't share them with each other. They were flying blind, each woman figuring out independently how to get through each day without losing her mind. Penny Marshall became more assertive. She started setting boundaries. If Lander or McKean tried to interrupt her scenes, she'd push back. She'd stand her ground. She wasn't going to let them diminish her on camera or off. This approach sometimes worked. Sometimes it made things worse. But at least she was fighting back in her own way. The problem was that fighting back took energy. It meant staying vigilant. It meant never fully relaxing on set. It meant going home exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. Cindy Williams took a different path. She became more internal. She focused on her character. She poured herself into the work itself, trying to create a kind of protective bubble around her performance. If she could just stay in character, stay focused on the comedy, maybe she could avoid the personal attacks. Maybe if she didn't give them a reaction, they'd lose interest and move on to someone else. It was a form of emotional armor, and it worked to a point, but it also meant bottling things up. It meant carrying emotions she had no outlet for. Both women had one thing in common. They didn't tell anyone what was really happening. There were powerful reasons for this silence. In the 1970s and 80s, the entertainment industry operated under an unspoken code. If you complained about a male colleague, especially one who was popular and profitable, you were the problem. You were difficult. You were ungrateful. You were threatening the show. There were dozens of actresses who would love to have your role. The logic went, if you couldn't handle the pressure, step aside. Cindy and Penny knew this. They understood the stakes. Their careers were on the line. Not just their current jobs, but their futures in television. If word got out that they were causing problems with the show stars, producers would remember that. Other shows would hear about it. Casting directors would be warned. You don't survive in Hollywood by being labeled a troublemaker. There was also shame involved. There's a particular kind of shame that comes from being mistreated and not fighting back. Cindy and Penny both internalized their experiences. They wondered if they'd done something to deserve it. They wondered if they were overreacting. They wondered if complaining would make them look weak. These are the psychological patterns that keep people silent in abusive situations. And let's be clear, what was happening on the set of Laverne and Shirley was a form of abuse. It wasn't physical violence, but it was psychological and emotional abuse. It was designed to control and diminish. It was designed to maintain a hierarchy where the men on top stayed on top, and the women below knew their place. For 8 seasons, Cindy and Penny endured this. They showed up. They performed. They made people laugh. And they went home and cried. They talked to therapists. They confided in close friends. But they never spoke publicly about what was happening. The show was too big. The stakes were too high. The silence felt like the only option. Until it wasn't. There was a specific moment. A turning point that could have changed everything. It happened during the 5th season, when tensions on set had reached a breaking point that was almost unbearable. Penny Marshall had finally had enough. She went to the producers, not to complain, not to get McKean and Lander in trouble. She went to them as a professional asking for help. She explained what was happening. She described the behavior. She asked if something could be done to make the set a safer, more respectful place to work. What happened next was predictable, but it was also devastating. The producers listened, and then they did nothing. They didn't have a conversation with McKean and Lander. They didn't establish new ground rules. They didn't make any changes at all. Instead, they essentially told Penny that this was how things were, and if she couldn't handle it, that was her problem. The message was clear: your discomfort is less important than their talent. Your well-being doesn't matter as much as their value to the show. Cindy Williams wasn't aware that Penny had gone to the producers. But when nothing changed, when the behavior continued exactly as before, Penny understood something crucial. The system wasn't going to protect her. The people in power weren't going to help her. She was on her own. This is the moment when many people in similar situations make a choice. They either escalate, they go public, they make a formal complaint, they risk everything to stand up for themselves, or they accept the situation as unchangeable and find a way to live with it. Penny chose acceptance. Not because she wanted to, but because the alternative felt too risky. Going public would have meant fighting not just McKean and Lander, but the entire studio system. It would have meant sacrificing her career. It would have meant becoming the villain in a story where the real villains would control the narrative. Cindy Williams, in her own way, had already made the same choice. She had already decided that survival meant silence, that getting through each day intact was victory enough. What's important to understand is that this wasn't weakness. This was rational decision-making in an irrational system. They were assessing real risks and making the best choice available to them in an impossible situation. But it came at a cost. It meant normalizing behavior that should never be normal. It meant allowing a pattern of abuse to continue unchecked. It meant both women carrying this burden alone for decades. Years would pass. The show would end. Both women would move on to other projects. But they would never forget what happened on that set. And they would never talk about it publicly until now. The silence had lasted 50 years. But silence, no matter how long it lasts, eventually breaks. In a rare joint interview, Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall finally sat down together to discuss what happened. And for the first time, they learned that they hadn't been alone in their suffering. They'd both been carrying the same weight. They'd both been surviving the same environment. They'd both been silent for the same reasons. When Penny told Cindy that she'd gone to the producers and been dismissed, Cindy's eyes filled with tears. She realized that even when she'd thought about speaking up, the system had already decided it wouldn't listen. The deck was stacked against them from the beginning. But here's what's remarkable. Both women are speaking now. They're breaking 50 years of silence not for revenge, not to destroy anyone's legacy, but because they believe the truth matters. They believe that the entertainment industry needs to understand what really happened behind the scenes of one of its most beloved shows. They believe that younger actresses need to know they're not alone if they experience similar treatment. And they believe that the culture of silence that protected abusers for decades needs to end. Cindy Williams describes the experience as liberating. For so long, she'd kept these memories locked away. She'd told the story in fragments to close friends, but never the full narrative. Never publicly. Never with Penny by her side, validating that yes, this really happened, and yes, we both felt it, and yes, it was wrong. Speaking about it now feels like taking back her power from a situation where she felt powerless for so many years. Penny Marshall talks about the anger she still carries. Not anger at herself for not fighting harder, but anger at a system that made silence feel like the only option. She talks about the young women coming up in the industry today and how she wishes she could tell them. Speak up. Don't wait 50 years like I did. Don't carry this alone. There are people who will listen now. There are systems in place to protect you now. Use them. What both women emphasize is that they're not trying to erase Lenny and Squiggy from television history. Michael McKean and David L. Lander were talented performers. Their characters were funny and beloved. That's all still true. But talent doesn't excuse cruelty. Success doesn't justify abuse. And legacy doesn't mean silence. The real lesson here is bigger than one show, one cast, or one era. It's about the cost of silence. It's about how systems protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It's about how women learn to survive by staying quiet, and how breaking that silence, even 50 years later, takes courage. Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall spent decades laughing for cameras while hurting in private. They created joy for millions of people while suffering in silence themselves. But now, finally, they're choosing their own story. They're choosing honesty over comfort. They're choosing to be heard. And maybe, just maybe, by speaking now, they can help ensure that the next generation of actresses won't have to choose between their careers and their dignity. They won't have to suffer in silence for 50 years. They won't have to discover decades later that their pain was shared but never acknowledged. That's what breaking silence really means. It means taking back power. It means refusing to let the past stay buried. And it means believing that truth, no matter how late it arrives, still matters. So here's my question for you. Do you think the entertainment industry has really changed since the 1970s and 80s? Or do you think women are still being forced to choose between speaking up and keeping their jobs? What would you have done in Cindy and Penny's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have this conversation.